I have served the Duke of Kalemore for 11 years. I polished his boots through a war that left him harder than the stone walls of Kalemore Hall. I pressed his coats through 3 London seasons he endured like a man walking barefoot on ice, present, correct, and completely unmoved. I have witnessed his silences, which were famous, and his tempers, which were not tantrums but something colder and more precise, like a window latch snapping shut in November. I know the sound of every room in that house at every hour. I know when the floorboard outside his study speaks, and I know the exact weight of his footfall when he is merely displeased versus the particular stillness that comes over him when he is furious. So when I tell you that a woman of no fortune, no connections, and no particular social standing turned the Duke of Kalemore into the most devoted man I have ever seen, you must understand that I say it not as a sentimental old servant inventing a pretty tale. I say it as a witness. I was there for all of it. I saw it happen in stages, each one more improbable than the last, beginning with the most dangerous letter that ever arrived at Kalemore Hall. The letter was from his grandmother. Her Grace the Dowager Duchess of Kalemore was 81 years old, had outlived 2 husbands, 4 prime ministers, and the patience of every person who had ever tried to manage her, and she was, by any measure I could apply, the single most formidable creature I had encountered in a life of service to formidable creatures. She had a country estate in the Highland foothills called Ardenvale, which she ran with the precision of a general and the warmth of a woman who had decided, sometime around her 65th year, that she had earned the right to say exactly what she thought to everyone always, without apology. The Duke respected her. He was, in fact, afraid of her, though he would have walked barefoot through Kalemore's north pasture in January before he admitted it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October. I brought it to him on the silver tray, as always. He read the first 2 lines, set it down, and looked at the fire for a long moment in the way that meant he was calculating something. "She is hosting a house party," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "At Ardenvale in November." "So I understand." "She wants me there for a fortnight." "Yes." He picked the letter up again and read the rest. I watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the kind of movement only 11 years of proximity could detect. "She has also invited," he said, with the deliberate calm of a man reading a sentence he wishes he could unread, "a Miss Penelope Ashwick, the youngest daughter of the late Sir Edmund Ashwick, who apparently died owing rather a great deal to rather a great number of people." "I see," I said. "She describes her as a young woman of excellent character and quiet accomplishment." He set the letter down again. "My grandmother does not use the phrase excellent character unless she is trying to sell me something." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation. "She has arranged this," he said. "It was not a question." "It does appear that way, Your Grace." He stood. He walked to the window. Outside, the first thin snow of the season was beginning, drifting sideways past the glass in a way that suggested it had no particular destination and no urgency about arriving there. He watched it for what felt like a full minute. "Write to her," he said at last. "Tell her I will come. Tell her I am delighted." "Are you delighted, Your Grace?" He turned from the window. He gave me the look that had silenced officers in the field and reduced at least 2 solicitors to stammering apologies. "No," he said, "I am not delighted, but she is 81 years old and she is my grandmother, and I am not going to tell her I won't come because I suspect she is scheming. She will simply scheme harder." He moved toward the door. "Pack for a fortnight. Pack the gray coat and the heavy one. It will be cold." He was already in the corridor when I said, quietly to the empty room, "Yes, Your Grace." I packed for a fortnight. The journey north took 2 days by carriage, and we arrived at Ardenvale on a Thursday afternoon when the light was the color of old pewter, and the hills beyond the house were the precise shade of heather gray that I had always associated with the Dowager Duchess herself, ancient, dramatic, and completely unyielding. The house was warm. The fires had been laid in every room. The smell of wood smoke and something baking met us in the entrance hall, and the Dowager Duchess herself was standing at the foot of the main staircase with her ivory-handled cane, and the expression of a woman who has won every hand she has ever played and knows it. "Cailmore," she said, which was what she called the Duke when she was pleased with him. "You look thin." "I look exactly as I always look," he said, and bent to kiss her cheek, which was the closest either of them ever came to tenderness in public. "You look thin and you look tired and you need feeding and fresh air and good company," she said serenely. "I have arranged for all three." She glanced past him at the cases I was managing with a footman's help. "Thomas, you are looking well." "Your Grace," I said, because after 11 years I had learned that the Dowager Duchess noticed everyone, and it was wise to acknowledge that she did. She smiled, a smile that contained, if one looked carefully, a quantity of private satisfaction, and led us into the drawing-room for tea. The other guests were already assembled. There was Lord and Lady Pembroke, who were old friends of the Dowager's, and who spent every conversation finishing each other's sentences with the comfortable ease of two people who have been married so long they have become a single organism. There was a Captain Hawsley, a distant cousin of the Duke's, who was pleasant and loud, and took up approximately twice the space his physical body occupied. There was Mrs. Forthwell, a widow of 60 who collected first editions and opinions in equal measure. And there was, seated slightly apart from the others near the window with a book open on her lap, and the expression of someone who is politely pretending to read while being acutely aware of a room she has not quite found her footing in, there was Miss Penelope Ashwick. I noticed her at once because she was not what I had expected. I had expected, given the Dowager's machinations, someone overtly pretty in an obvious way, someone who would be deployed like a chess piece in a gambit, impossible to miss. Miss Ashwick was not that. She was perhaps 24, with light brown hair dressed simply, and a face that was not plain but was rather the kind of face that reveals itself over time rather than all at once, quiet eyes, a thoughtful mouth, the kind of stillness that in certain lights looked like shyness and in others looked like composure. She wore a gown of soft gray wool that was clean and well-made and not new. She sat with the book at an angle that suggested she was genuinely using it as a shield, which I found, privately, the most honest thing in the room. The Duke saw her. He registered her. I know his eyes and the specific quality of attention they give to any new thing entering his field. And then he crossed the room to pay his respects to Lord Pembroke, which was to say that he successfully performed the appearance of having not particularly noticed her at all. The Dowager Duchess caught my eye from across the room. Her expression said, clear as print, "Watch." I watched. Dinner that first evening was 17 people. The house party had grown since the original letter, as these things always do under the Dowager's management, and I oversaw the preparation of the Duke's formal dress with the usual efficiency and then stationed myself, as was my custom in houses not our own, in the corridor that ran alongside the dining room, where I could hear without being present. The Duke had been seated, I noted with no surprise whatsoever, directly across from Miss Ashwick. I heard the dinner begin. I heard the usual music of a formal meal, crystal and silver, the low tide of many voices, the occasional laugh from Captain Hawsley, who laughed at everything and always too loudly. I heard the Dowager Duchess presiding at the head of the table, with the serene authority of someone conducting an orchestra that only she can hear. What I did not hear, for quite some time, was the Duke say anything at all. This was not unusual. He was not a dinner-table conversationalist. He observed. He answered when spoken to with the minimum sufficient words. He deployed his silences with the same precision he applied to everything else, so that they communicated depending on their quality and duration, either indifference or displeasure, or, on rare occasions, the particular attentiveness of a man who is listening far more carefully than he appears to be. What was unusual was that, when I finally heard his voice, It was not answering a question from Lord Pembroke about the northern wool trade or from Captain Hawsley about some matter of horses or hounds. He was talking to Miss Ashwick. The words were indistinct through the wall, but the rhythm was not. A short sentence from him, a pause, a longer response from her, another pause, and this was the thing I stood very still for, a laugh from the Duke. Not the social variety which was brief and deployed like punctuation. Something quieter, something that sounded as though it had surprised him. I stood in the corridor for the rest of the dinner with my hands folded behind my back, and the expression of a man thinking about nothing, which was of course the expression of a man thinking very hard about something specific. In the morning I laid out his clothes and said nothing. He said nothing either. He went down to breakfast and I went about the work of the day, and I did not think about the laugh in the corridor. I thought about it quite a lot. The days at Ardenvale had a rhythm that the Dowager had arranged with the expertise of a woman who understood that forcing people together produces nothing except resistance, while providing them with a shared space and a reasonable excuse to occupy it produces, over time, almost anything she needed. There were morning walks. The hills were cold and clear and smelled of bracken and clean frost, and there were afternoons in the library, which was vast and warm, and contained the kind of books that make a room feel like a conversation. There were dinners, always fine, always long. There were evenings in the drawing-room with music from Mrs. Forthwell, who played the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than precision, and cards from Lord Pembroke and the captain, and the Dowager Duchess holding court in her high-backed chair near the fire like something between a queen and a weather system. And there was, woven through all of it, the particular thread of what was happening between the Duke of Cailmore and Miss Penelope Ashwick. On the second day I observed the following. During the morning walk, the Duke fell into step beside her on the path that crossed the east field, not by design, or at least not visibly, and they walked together for perhaps a quarter of an hour without any of the other guests near enough to hear. When they returned to the house, he held the gate for her. He had never in 11 years held a gate for anyone, not because he was rude, but because it had simply never occurred to him. He was a man who passed through the world and the world rearranged itself. The gate holding was the work of the world, not of the Duke. He held the gate. On the third day I observed the following. In the afternoon, Miss Ashwick was in the library. She had been in the library on the first and second afternoons as well, and I had begun to understand that it was not strategy but genuine preference. She was a reader in the way that some people are musicians, by nature and by need. The Duke went to the library on the third afternoon at 2:30. The Duke had not, in the 2 days prior, been in the library in the afternoon. He had been in the study reviewing correspondence. I know his schedule as well as I know the floorboards. He spent an hour and 20 minutes in the library. When he came out, he was carrying a book, something from the history shelf, I noted. He was not, to my knowledge, a man who read history for pleasure. On the fourth day, something happened that was not an observation, but an accident of geography. I was carrying fresh linen to one of the upper rooms when I passed the small sitting room off the east corridor, the door of which was ajar, and I heard 2 voices. I did not slow. I am a man of discretion, but I have good ears, and the walls at Ardenvale, for all their grandeur, are not thick. "You are not what I expected," the Duke was saying. There was no particular expression in his voice, which meant he was being careful. "I am never," said Miss Ashwick, "what anyone expects. I have grown rather accustomed to it." "That sounds like something you've said before." "It sounds," she said, "like something I've had to learn to say before. There is a difference." A silence. And then the Duke said, "What was your father like?" which was so far from anything I would have predicted from that particular mouth that I nearly stopped walking. "He was kind," she said. "He was not careful. Kindness and carefulness are not the same thing, and my father chose kindness every time, which is why he died owing money to people who were neither. I loved him very much." "And do you blame him?" For dying, no. For the debts, a pause. I have tried, I cannot quite manage it. He was kind. Another silence, longer than the first. I am not kind, the Duke said. I could not hear whether he meant it as a confession or a warning. I know, she said. And then, after a beat, you were kind to Mrs. Forthwell this morning when she played the wrong piece and no one else said anything at all. You told her it suited the room better. She nearly wept. A long pause. That, he said, was not kindness. That was efficiency. A weeping Mrs. Forthwell would have disrupted the entire morning. Miss Ashwick said something then that I almost missed because I had moved on as I ought to have done. But I caught the edge of it, the shape of a laugh, warm and unhurried, as though she found him genuinely funny rather than performing amusement. And I walked on down the corridor with the linen over my arm, thinking that this woman was either the bravest person I had ever encountered, or she simply did not understand what the Duke of Calemore was. I thought by the end of the day that it was neither. I thought she understood perfectly. She simply wasn't afraid. This, I came to believe, was what undid him. He had been managed by people his whole life, managed with deference and careful strategy, and the particular anxiety that his power produced in almost everyone around him. Even his mother had handled him carefully. His friends, what few he had, spoke to him with a kind of lateral approach, never quite directly. His staff, myself included, operated around the edges of his moods rather than into them. Miss Ashwick went straight in. Not rudely, not provocatively, but directly, with the calm of someone who has been in circumstances so reduced that social anxiety has been stripped back to nothing, who has managed a household in debt, who has faced creditors and lawyers, and the polite contempt of a world that writes off the daughters of men who die without leaving them adequately provided for, and who has come through all of it with her spine intact and her judgment unclouded. She had nothing to protect, socially speaking, and this gave her a freedom that I could see the Duke found disorienting, and then, increasingly, something else. He found it like air. On the 5th day, the Dowager Duchess summoned me. She did this sometimes. The senior staff of visiting guests were treated at Ardenvale as something between colleagues and consultants, which was her way of gathering intelligence while pretending it was courtesy. I went to her private sitting room in the morning after the Duke had gone downstairs, and she was in her chair by the window with her tea and her particular expression of benign omniscience. "Well," she said. "Your Grace," I said carefully. "Don't your Grace me, Thomas. I have known you since you were a green boy who pressed coats crooked. How is he?" I considered my answer. Discretion demanded a neutral one. But she was 81 years old, and she had arranged all of this, and she was going to find out one way or another, and she had the authority, by blood and by decades of demonstrated wisdom, to know. "He held the gate for her on the 2nd morning," I said. The Dowager Duchess set down her tea. She folded her hands, and she smiled the smile of a woman who has played a very long game and seen the board go exactly the way she calculated. "He held the gate," she repeated. "Yes, your Grace." "He has never held a gate in his life." "No, your Grace." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the frost on the hills. "She is a good woman," she said, and there was nothing strategic in her voice now, just the plain warmth of an old woman saying a true thing. "She is honest, and she is brave, and she is the kind of person who would have made this family better for 40 years if I can manage to keep that boy from being a complete idiot for the next 10 days. He is not generally an idiot, your Grace. He is generally a man who has spent so long being afraid of being managed that he manages himself out of everything worth having." She picked up her tea again. "He needs someone who isn't impressed by him, Thomas. He has had enough of impressed. It makes him lonely, and he doesn't even know it." I said nothing to that, because there was nothing to add. She had named it precisely, as she always did, and I carried it back out into the corridor with me and turned it over in my mind for the rest of the morning. On the 6th day it snowed properly. Not the tentative flurries of arrival, but a genuine Highland snowfall, steady and serious, that made the hills disappear and the windows into white screens and the house into a ship at anchor, warm and self-contained. The outdoor walks were abandoned. Everyone gathered in the drawing room after breakfast with the particular cozy restlessness of people confined by weather and happy enough about it. The Duke stood at the window. Miss Ashwick was at the writing desk in the corner. She wrote letters in the mornings, I had noticed, letters that she folded carefully and addressed in a hand that was clear and even, and put them in the post herself rather than entrusting them to the household staff, which told me that she had people depending on her and that she took that seriously. She finished her letter, sealed it, and looked up and found the Duke looking at her. She did not look away. He did. This was the first time I had seen him be the one to look away, and I noted it with the quiet certainty of a man who recognizes a significant moment when it is happening in front of him, even if he is technically supposed to be attending to a matter of boot polish. After luncheon, when the snow had softened from heavy to ornamental, the Dowager Duchess produced a suggestion, as casually as though it had just occurred to her, that the younger members of the party might enjoy a walk through the covered arcade at the back of the house, which was sheltered enough for a stroll without the full weight of the weather. This produced a general agreement and a mild reorganization of the room, and when it resolved itself, the Duke and Miss Ashwick were walking side by side in the arcade with Lord and Lady Pembroke some distance ahead of them, and Captain Hawsley had been redirected, I suspected by the Dowager's invisible hand, to discuss a matter of horsemanship with the estate's head groom. I watched from the doorway at the arcade's far end. They walked. The snow fell softly past the open sides of the arcade, and the light was white and even and very quiet. I could not hear them, but I could see the shape of the conversation, not a performance of politeness but the real thing, the kind where two people lean very slightly toward each other because they are listening rather than merely waiting for their turn to speak. I saw her say something that made her look down at the ground for a moment, as though it cost her something to say, and I saw him stop walking, just briefly, just a half step, and then continue, and say something short in response, and she looked up at him with an expression that was not guarded for the first time since she had arrived. I turned away from the doorway. It was not my business, and I had already seen enough to know what it was. The seventh day was the day that should have been the end of it. In my experience, in the management of large houses and complicated people, there is always a seventh day, a moment when the thing that was quietly building tips sideways, or someone says something ill-considered, or a piece of the arrangement is exposed, and the whole structure must survive the exposure, or it will not survive at all. The seventh day arrived at breakfast. Lord Pembroke, who was a kind man and a careless one, said, in the middle of a general conversation about the party's composition, and whether the Duke found Ardenvale improved from his last visit, something to the effect that it was good of the Dowager Duchess to have assembled such a congenial group, and that he for one thought it particularly clever to have included Miss Ashwick, of whose family he had a passing acquaintance, and that he imagined the Dowager had thought very deliberately about the guest list. Indeed, said the Dowager serenely, spreading marmalade on her toast. Lord Pembroke, emboldened by the marmalade, said, Miss Ashwick, I understand you and the Dowager Duchess have been acquainted some time. Miss Ashwick said, with perfect composure, Her Grace has been very kind to my family. I wondered, said Lord Pembroke, still pleasant, still careless, whether it was Her Grace who suggested your attendance, or whether you had been, encouraged in the connection by other means. There was a small pause, not a long one, but the kind that has weight. I received an invitation, said Miss Ashwick, with the same composure, from Her Grace. I was grateful for it. Of course, said Lord Pembroke, he meant nothing by it. He had already moved on to buttering his own toast, and comparing the Ardenvale butter unfavorably to some butter he had encountered in a house in Gloucestershire, and the conversation moved with him. But the Duke had not moved. I was standing at the sideboard managing the coffee service, which meant I had a direct view of the table. I watched the Duke's face in the moment that followed Lord Pembroke's question and Miss Ashwick's answer. He was very still. He was looking at Miss Ashwick, and she was looking at her plate, and in the space between those two things something was happening that I recognized with the particular sorrow of a man who has watched many things come close to going wrong. He was calculating. He was doing what the Dowager had described, managing himself. Running the arithmetic of the situation. The invitation was the Dowager's. Miss Ashwick had been brought here deliberately. He had known from the first letter that his grandmother was scheming, and he had come anyway, and he had allowed himself, because that was the word for it, allowed a decision, even if it had felt like something else entirely. He had allowed himself over 6 days to find this woman, this quiet, brave, unhurried woman, worth talking to and worth watching and worth the particular attentiveness he gave to almost nothing outside of the management of his estate and the memory of those he had lost. And now the arithmetic was running. Was it real? Or had he simply walked into a room that had been arranged around him by an 81-year-old woman with an ivory cane and a mind like a chess engine? He pushed back from the table. "Excuse me," he said, to no one in particular, and left. The room adjusted itself around his absence with the practiced ease of a group of people accustomed to powerful men having moods. Captain Hawsley filled the gap with something about the morning's prospects for a ride if the snow cleared. Lord Pembroke agreed enthusiastically. Miss Ashwick lifted her tea and looked out the window and said nothing at all, but her hand around the cup was very still, and I knew that she was as aware as I was of exactly what had just happened. I excused myself from the sideboard in the least obtrusive way available to me, and went to find the Duke. He was in the library. He was not reading. He was standing at the window that looked north, toward the snow-covered hills that were barely visible through the low cloud, with his hands clasped behind his back and his shoulders set in the particular line that meant he was engaged in a conversation with himself that was not going well. I came into the room. I set down the coffee I had brought. It was the work of a moment to collect it from the sideboard before I left, and I poured him a cup and placed it on the table nearest to him and said nothing. He said without turning from the window, "Did you know?" "Know what, Your Grace?" "Don't," he said, not harshly, flatly. "You know everything that happens in any house I inhabit within 48 hours of our arrival. Did you know she arranged this?" "I knew that Her Grace's letter mentioned Miss Ashwick specifically," I said. "I did not know the extent of the arrangement." "But you suspected." "I considered this. I suspected something, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And you said nothing?" "You said nothing either, Your Grace. You knew from the letter you came." He turned at this. He looked at me with the particular measuring expression of a man being told something he already knows, but had been hoping might remain unsaid. "I came," he said. "You came because she is your grandmother and you respect her, and because, as you said yourself, if you refused she would scheme harder. And because I stopped." "Because," he said, with the flat warning of a man who will not be comfortable with whatever follows. "Because she has never in 81 years steered you wrong," I said. "Her Grace. She has been wrong about many things, but she has never been wrong about what you needed." He turned back to the window. The silence stretched. Outside, the snow was doing its patient work on the hills. "She is here because my grandmother arranged it," he said. "Yes. She came here knowing she was being positioned." "I don't think she knew the extent of it," I said carefully. "She strikes me as a woman who would have found the journey worth making simply for the library and the change of air." A pause. "She said something to me on the second day," he said. It was the voice he used for things he had not planned to say. "She said that she had not expected the house to be warm." "Physically warm, Your Grace?" "I asked her that. She said both." He was quiet for a moment. She has been used to cold houses, the kind that come of managing a household on very little. I said nothing. He did not need me to say anything. My grandmother chose her, he said, and then after a beat, she chose well. He picked up the coffee I had brought. He drank it standing at the window, and then he set the cup down and said, "What time is dinner?" "7:30, Your Grace." "Then I have the afternoon." He left the library. I tidied the cup from the table and followed, because that is what I do, and I did not allow myself an expression until I was in the corridor alone, at which point I permitted myself something that, in a younger man, might have been called relief. What he did with the afternoon was this: he went to find Miss Ashwick. I know this because I was told by the second housemaid, who told the first housemaid, who was the niece of my counterpart in the Dowager's permanent staff, which meant the whole household's intelligence was effectively available to me within the hour. He found her in the small sitting room off the east corridor, the same room where I had overheard them 4 days before, and he was there for nearly 2 hours. I do not know precisely what was said, but I know what he had come to say, because I know him, and because what followed made the subject of that conversation perfectly legible. He had come, I think, to say something simple and difficult, that he knew about the arrangement, that he was not angry, that what had grown in him over 6 days was not an artifact of his grandmother's engineering, but something that had happened in spite of it, or alongside it, or through it, something real that he was willing to claim as his own, if she would allow it. Whether he said it as simply as that I do not know. He was not by nature a simple man. But she was a woman of direct speech and direct feeling, and I think what happened in that room was that he tried to be direct and found that she met him there, which is a rarer thing than people admit. Dinner that evening had a different quality to it. Not dramatic. The Duke was not a dramatic man, and Miss Ashwick was not a dramatic woman, and the Dowager Duchess was far too wise to allow drama where the quieter thing would serve better. But there was something different in the room's temperature, some alteration in the air between certain chairs, that I think most of the assembled guests sensed without being able to name. Lord Pembroke seemed simply cheerful. Captain Hawsley ate enthusiastically and talked about horses. Mrs. Forthwell made a point about book restoration that took 12 minutes and was genuinely interesting. The Duke and Miss Ashwick said very little to each other across the table. But when he passed her the salt, an act I had not seen him perform for anyone, in or out of his own house, in 11 years, I saw her look at him with the expression I had seen taking shape for a week now, the one that was not guarded, the one that looked like the precise opposite of performing composure. After dinner in the drawing-room, Mrs. Forthwell played, correctly this time, the piece she had intended, which was a Scotch air that suited the house and the weather and the hour perfectly. Captain Hawsley persuaded Lady Pembroke into a hand of cards. The Dowager Duchess sat in her chair and observed everything and said very little, which was how I knew she was pleased. The Duke sat near the fire, not in it, with the manner of a man who is present in a way he usually is not managing the room, not computing the social arithmetic, but actually there. Miss Ashwick was on the other side of the fireplace with a book she was not entirely reading. Every few pages she would look up, and he would be looking at the fire, and then she would look back at the page, and once, only once, but I saw it, he looked at her when she was not looking at him, and his face did the thing I had never seen it do in 11 years of proximity. It went soft, not weak, not unguarded in a way that would alarm anyone, but soft the way stone goes warm in afternoon sun, not changed in its nature, only in its quality, there and gone in a moment, but I had seen it and I folded it away and I thought, there it is. The fortnight continued. There were 5 more days, and they were not dramatic days, but they were days in which something was built with the patience and consistency that only genuine feeling produces. There were more walks and more dinners and more evenings by the fire and more conversations in which two people found that the world between them was larger and more comfortable than either had expected to discover. On the 8th day, he asked her about her reading, not as a pleasantry, as a genuine question, the kind that expects a real answer and waits for it. They were in the library in the afternoon, which had become, without either of them acknowledging it, a shared hour, a quiet understanding that this was where they would be. She had been reading a volume on the natural philosophy of birds, which she found more compelling than she could easily explain, and when he asked she said so without apology, that there was something about the way a bird could navigate by stars and wind and the particular pull of the earth that she found not comforting exactly, but orienting. As though it was possible to know where you were by means that had nothing to do with what other people told you about your position. He looked at her for a long moment after she said that. "You have spent some time," he said carefully, "being told an incorrect version of your position." She tilted her head. "Hasn't everyone?" "Some more than others." "Yes," she agreed, "some more than others." And she looked out the library window at the snow with the expression of a woman who has decided not to be angry about it and finds that this decision, while correct, is sometimes still a great deal of work. He picked up a book from the shelf nearest him, not looking at the spine, not caring what it was, and opened it. And they read in the same room for the rest of the afternoon in a silence that was, I would have said if pressed to describe it, the most companionable silence I had heard in 11 years of the Duke's various silences. On the 9th day, something happened that I did not witness but was told about by the second housemaid, who had it from the kitchen girl who was sweeping the passage outside the blue parlor at the time. Miss Ashwick had been sitting with Mrs. Forthwell in the blue parlor after luncheon when the Duke came looking for, ostensibly, a letter he had mislaid. He found it almost immediately on the side table, which any man paying attention to the room rather than its occupants would have spotted at once. He did not leave immediately after finding it. He stayed for 20 minutes in which Mrs. Forthwell, who was not subtle, for all that she was intelligent, found a reason to step out and speak to someone in the corridor, and so left them. The kitchen girl could not hear the words, but she could hear the rhythm of it, long and easy and occasionally interrupted by the particular quality of quiet that meant both people were thinking rather than merely pausing. And once, near the end, there was a short sentence from him and a longer response from her, and then a laugh from him, that same sound, warm and surprised, and then the sound of the letter being picked up and footsteps leaving the room. I thought about that laugh all through the evening. There was something about it that was becoming a fixed point for me in the whole of the fortnight, a measure of how far we had come from the drawing-room on the first evening, when he had stood at the window watching the snow and said, "I am not kind," to a woman he had known for hours. The laugh was the evidence that he was wrong, not wrong about his nature. He was still the Duke of Calemore in all his precision and containment, but wrong about the absolute nature of it. He was not kind the way easy men are kind. He was kind the way difficult men sometimes are, effortfully and precisely, in ways that cost something and therefore mean more. She had seen this from very early on. That, I thought, was what he found so disorienting about her, not her intelligence, which was considerable, nor her directness, which was bracing, but the simple fact that she had looked at him and seen clearly and not recoiled and not been dazzled. She had simply looked and taken him as he was and found him worth looking at. This was perhaps the most radical thing any person had ever done in his presence. On the 10th day, the Duke of Calemore did something extraordinary. He asked Miss Ashwick if she would like to see the horses. This is not, on its face, extraordinary. Showing a guest the stables is a routine courtesy at any country estate, but these were not his stables. This was not his estate. He had no particular claim on the Ardenvale horses, and no reason to be leading anyone on a tour of them, except that he had apparently noticed that she had lingered near the paddock fence on one of the earlier walks, watching the horses move in the snow with an attention that was not casual, and he had remembered this, and he had decided on the 10th morning to do something about it. The head groom told my counterpart in the permanent staff about it afterward, because it was the kind of thing that becomes household legend. The Duke of Calemore, famous for looking through people and at horses with equal detachment, standing at the paddock rail next to a young woman in a gray coat and explaining, without being asked, without prompting, with a patience and specificity that was entirely unlike his usual mode, the particular qualities of each of the 3 horses that were turned out in the near paddock. She asked questions, good ones apparently. The groom had been impressed enough to mention it. They were there for an hour. On the 11th day, she wrote a longer letter than usual in the morning. I do not know its contents, but I know that when she sealed it and addressed it, her expression was not the careful composure of someone executing a necessary task, but the absorbed look of someone who has had a great deal to say and is pleased to have found words for it. I watched all of it. I watched it the way I watched everything, with the quiet, professional attention of a man who is paid to see clearly and say little. And what I saw over those 5 days was not the Dowager Duchess's scheme succeeding. Schemes succeed mechanically. They force proximity. They engineer circumstance. They manage the conditions. But what I saw was something that schemes can arrange the conditions for, but cannot manufacture themselves. 2 people discovering that they were, against all probability, each other's. The Dowager had opened the room. She had not furnished what happened inside it. That was their own work entirely, and it was the realest work I had watched done in 11 years of close observation. On the 12th day, the Dowager Duchess summoned me again. "Well," she said. "He marked a passage in the history book," I said, "for her in pencil." She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and when she opened them there was something in them, not triumph, not the satisfaction of the chess player, but something older and quieter, the feeling of a woman who has loved a difficult boy for his entire life and waited a long time to see him arrive at the thing she had always known was possible. "He will do it himself," I said. "I know," she said. "I only needed to get him in the room." On the 13th day, she told him. I believe it was her choice to do it, to be the one to say it, rather than let the uncertainty sit between them until the house party ended and the arrangements of departure undid everything. She was, as I have said, a woman of direct speech. And I think she had decided, somewhere in the last several days, that she would not allow the arrangement to remain unaddressed between them, because if it remained unaddressed then, whatever he felt would always be tangled up in the question of whether it was real or whether he had simply been managed into warmth by an old woman's clever guest list. She told me this later, not at the time. She told me what had happened in that conversation, because by then we were past the careful distances of acquaintance. But she told me, and so I know. She found him in the library after breakfast, and she said, without preamble, that she wished to be honest with him about something she suspected he had already understood but had not said aloud between them. "I was invited here," she said, "because your grandmother thought we might suit. I knew when I accepted the invitation that there was something of that in it. I accepted because my circumstances are not grand, and because I liked her when I met her, and because I thought that even if nothing came of the main design, a fortnight in a warm house with a good library was worth the journey." She paused. I did not expect to find that she was right. He looked at her for a long moment. "She is usually right," he said. "So I am learning." Another pause. The fire in the library was the only sound. "I need to ask you something," he said, directly. "Please do. Is what has happened between us this fortnight, is it the house party, the arrangement, the warmth of being somewhere comfortable and the pleasantness of the days, or is it—" He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words, but this particular sentence was finding its edges with difficulty, because it mattered. "Is it something you would carry with you when you leave?" She looked at him with those quiet eyes, and I was not there. But I know what that look was because I had watched it form over 13 days. The look that had nothing behind it, no performance, no protection. "Yes," she said. And he said nothing for a moment. And then he said, "Then I would like to speak to you again. Not here. At home in London, where the arrangements of Ardenvale are not between us, if you would allow it." "Yes," she said again. And that was the 13th day. On the 14th day, the last morning before the party broke apart and the carriages came, there was a breakfast that had the quality of a conclusion that is also a beginning. All 17 people at the long table, the fire going well. The snow outside the windows settled into something clean and still and very beautiful. The Dowager Duchess at the head of it, all presiding with the look of a woman who has arranged everything and is gracious enough not to say so. At some point during the second course, Lord Pembroke said something genial about what a splendid fortnight it had been, and several voices agreed, and Captain Hawsley proposed a toast to the Dowager Duchess for the hospitality, and glasses were raised, and the Dowager accepted this with a wave of her cane that managed simultaneously to be modest and completely certain of its own authority. The Duke at the far end of the table raised his glass. He looked at his grandmother. He said, "Thank you," and he meant something specific by it, which she received with the composure of a woman who has been waiting a long time to hear it. Miss Ashwick beside him, she had been moved to his end of the table on this last morning, a final adjustment of the Dowager's invisible hand, looked down at her plate for a moment and then looked up, and the Duke was looking at her, and neither of them said anything, and I watched from my station at the sideboard and thought, there it is again. The carriages came in the early afternoon. The goodbyes were warm and slightly extended in the way of parties that have gone well, with Lady Pembroke embracing Miss Ashwick and making her promise to call when next in London, and Captain Hawsley shaking the Duke's hand with a heartiness that made the Duke's expression flicker very briefly towards something that was almost warmth. Mrs. Forthwell pressed a book on someone. The household staff moved around the periphery of all of it, efficient and invisible, as we are trained to be. I brought the Duke's coat and hat. He put them on in the entrance hall and then turned, not to the door, not to the carriage, and went back to where the Dowager Duchess was standing with her cane and the last of her assembled guests, and her face full of the satisfaction of a completed thing. He bent and kissed her cheek. "Well done," he said quietly, not sarcastically, not with the edge of a man acknowledging a trick, genuinely. She patted his arm. "I know what I am doing," she said. "I have always known what I am doing." "I know," he said. And then he went to Miss Ashwick, who was standing near the door with her traveling coat on and her small trunk loaded, and her expression very composed. The composure of a woman who is very good at not hoping for too much, a skill learned through long practice. He stood before her. He said quietly, "I will write to you tomorrow if that is acceptable." She looked up at him. "It is acceptable." "Good." And then, because he was the Duke of Cailmore and had 11 years of operating at the outer edges of warmth, and because this was new territory and he was approaching it with the care it deserved, "I find I would like to know you better, Miss Ashwick, in the ordinary world, where there are no arrangements." "I find," she said, "that I would like that too." He nodded. He put his hat on. He went to his carriage. I followed, because that is what I do. I climbed up beside the driver to give him room in the carriage. He always preferred the ride alone with space to think. And as we pulled away from Ardenvale's front steps, I looked back once, as I sometimes do, to fix the image of a place in my mind before it disappears. Miss Ashwick was still standing in the entrance. The snow was beginning again. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was watching the carriage, not with the performed indifference of someone pretending they are not watching, but with the honest attention of someone who has decided they are allowed to look at what matters to them. I looked forward again. The horses pulled us out through the gate, and down the long drive and onto the road. Inside the carriage, the Duke was very quiet. This was not the silence of a man computing the social arithmetic or managing himself out of something. It was the silence of a man who is thinking about something specific and finding that the thought is not uncomfortable. I knew this silence. I had not heard it before, but I recognized it the way you recognize a song you have never heard but somehow know the shape of. We were 2 miles from Ardenvale when he said, "To the air in the carriage, to nobody, to himself." She said both. I did not ask him what he meant. I knew what he meant. She had said that she had not expected the house to be warm, physically and otherwise. And he had been carrying that for 11 days like a man carrying something he didn't know the name of until he had been carrying it long enough to feel its shape. He knew its shape now. I am getting ahead of myself, which is the failing of a man who knows how a story ends and finds it difficult to tell it at the pace it actually moved. The truth is that the months that followed were not swift. He wrote to her the next day, as he had promised, and she wrote back, and the correspondence went on through the winter at a frequency that I noted by the increasing regularity with which I was asked to see that a letter was posted, and then by the increasing regularity with which letters arrived. He called on her in London in February, in the small house off the Strand where she lived with her mother and a younger sister, a house that was as spotlessly kept as the best efforts of limited means could manage, which was knowing her very well indeed. He called 3 times in February, twice in March. He brought nothing on the first call. It was a morning visit, the correct length, correctly conducted, during which he sat in the small front parlor of the house off the Strand and drank tea that had been made very carefully with what I suspected were the good leaves kept for important occasions, and talked with Miss Ashwick for an hour about a book she had mentioned in one of her letters and a matter of Highland estate management that she had asked him about. Because she was curious about everything and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, he left at the correct time. He came back 4 days later. On the 2nd February call he brought a book, not a gift exactly, or rather, not the formal kind. It was the history volume from the Ardenvale Library, the one he had marked in pencil, which he had apparently asked the Dowager's housekeeper to procure for him after he returned to London, and then held for 6 weeks while deciding whether to send it or deliver it in person. He delivered it in person. I know this because he asked me, on the morning of the second call, whether the book looked too presumptuous, which was the kind of question the Duke of Cailmore had never in 11 years asked about anything. I told him it looked like a book. Yes, he said, as though this was either reassuring or inadequate and he could not determine which. He took it anyway. He came back 2 hours after he left, and when he handed me his hat and coat in the entrance hall, there was a particular quality to his expression, not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but something between them, the feeling of a man who handed over something he was afraid would not land and found that it had landed well. In March he also met her sister, who was 17 and serious, and had apparently inherited the whole of the family's talent for looking directly at difficult things without flinching, because she looked at the Duke of Cailmore across the parlor with the frank assessment of a young woman who has been the practical head of a household for 2 years and is making up her mind about something important. He was, I was told, slightly more careful in his speech for the rest of that call than he usually was, which I found touching. And he met her mother, who was kind and frightened, and who had the eyes of a woman who has spent 2 years waiting for the next piece of bad news, and who looked at him, the Duke of Cailmore, with an expression that was so precisely balanced between hope and the effort not to hope that he was, I was told, visibly affected. He told me this himself, which was not his habit. He told me this in April, sitting in his study at the end of an evening, with the particular openness that had been appearing more and more frequently since Ardenvale, the specific thing that happened when a man who has been very closed for a very long time begins, cautiously, to open. Her mother looked at me, he said, as though I were either the best or worst news she had ever received and she didn't yet know which. And which are you? I asked. He looked at me. I intend to be the best, he said. In May, on a Thursday morning, I was in the dressing room laying out his coat when he came out of his bedroom already dressed and said, without sitting down for the usual routine, "I need the car this afternoon." "Of course, Your Grace. Where are you going?" "Off the Strand," he said. I looked at him. He said nothing else, but he was standing differently, not the managed composure of the Duke of Calemore in all his authority, but something underneath that, something that had been there all along and had simply been very carefully contained, which was, if I am being precise, a man who was hoping, and who found hoping unfamiliar and did not entirely know what to do with it. I handed him his hat. He left. I pressed nothing that afternoon. I did nothing productive. I sat in the dressing room with my hands in my lap and thought about a gate held open on a frost-covered path, and a laugh in a wall, and a passage marked in pencil in a history book, and a woman with her hands in her coat pockets watching a carriage go. He came back at 4:30. He came into the dressing room. He did not always come directly back. Sometimes he went to the study, sometimes to the drawing room. He came straight back, and he stood in the middle of the room and he said, "She said yes." And I, who have served this family for 11 years and who do not, as a matter of professional principle, perform sentiment in the line of duty, said, "Of course she did, Your Grace." And he looked at me, and his face did the thing it had done by the firelight at Ardenvale, the thing I had watched being learned over a fortnight and carefully maintained over 6 months of letters and visits, and a woman who went straight in instead of around, and this time it did not pass in a moment. He smiled. It was a simple thing, not wide or dramatic. Just a smile, the way a lamp is lit, the flame catching, the room changing, everything that was there before still there but different now in its quality, in its color. He sat down in the chair by the window that he used when he wanted to think, except that he was not thinking now. He was simply present in the room the way a man is present when there is nowhere else he wants to be. He said after a moment, "I asked her in the garden. There is a small garden at the back of the house. She keeps it herself," she said, "the kitchen garden especially, because it is something to tend that responds to tending." He was quiet for a moment. I told her I would like to be something she tended, if she was willing. I looked at him. He said nothing else, but I could see that the sentence had cost him something to say, and that she had received it in a way that made the cost entirely worthwhile, and that this was, in fact, the whole story in miniature. A man who had learned, late and with difficulty, to put something of himself into another person's hands, and a woman who took what was offered and held it carefully, and neither of them pretended it was easy or inevitable, and both of them chose it anyway. Her mother, I was told later, had wept. Her sister, I was told, had said nothing for a long moment and then said, with the frankness of a 17-year-old, who has been waiting for the family's situation to improve and has decided not to hide that she is pleased. "He seems very serious about it," which was, for the Duke of Calemore, as accurate a summary as anyone had ever produced. He wrote to the Dowager Duchess that evening. I sealed the letter myself and carried it to the post. I do not know what it said, but she wrote back the following morning. She must have sent the reply before she had finished reading his letter, so quickly did it arrive, and it said in her particular hand only, "I know, I have always known. Bring her north when the road's clear." He read this at breakfast. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. "She knew," he said. "Yes," I said, "she always does." I have served the Duke of Calemore for 11 years. I have seen him through a war and a title and 3 London seasons, and the weight of a great estate, and the loneliness of a man so accustomed to his own power that he had almost forgotten what it was to want something he could not simply manage into being. I have served him through all of that. I expect to serve him for 11 more years, and perhaps 11 more after that, through a house warming in a way it has not been before, through the voice of a woman who goes straight in, through a kitchen garden tended with care, through whatever comes next in the ordinary world, where there are no arrangements and it is all, every bit of it, the real thing. His grandmother knew what she was doing. She always did.